Have you ever lain next to the person you love and still felt like you were miles apart, like you can't find the way back to each other anymore? This video is my true story in Denmark. How my marriage fell into silence, how one gentle touch changed everything, and how I learned to love again from the smallest moments. If you're tired, hurting, or ready to give up, this might be the place your heart can finally breathe. The breaking point. Imagine waking up one ordinary Tuesday morning and realizing the air in your own home feels heavier than the winter sky outside. That was me, standing in a small apartment in Copenhagen, staring at the sink full of dishes and wondering how something as tiny as who forgot to buy milk had become a silent war. It's strange how love doesn't break loudly. It just softens until it starts to crumble, like snow melting before you even notice it was there. Why breaking point wasn't a fight. It wasn't shouting or slammed doors. It was the way we sat on opposite ends of the couch, close enough to touch, distant enough to feel like strangers. There's a particular ache that comes from loving someone who's right there but feels unreachable. Psychologists call it emotional withdrawal. I call it the slow sinking. Every unanswered question, every avoided conversation, every forced smile, they pile up until your heart feels like it's carrying a backpack full of wet stones. You know that feeling when you rehearse a sentence in your head 10 times but still can't say it out loud? That was my daily routine. I kept telling myself, it's just a rough phase. It'll pass. But phases don't magically pass when you let them run wild. They grow teeth. They bite. And yet, here's the funny thing. The human brain hates uncertainty more than it hates pain. Neuroscientists have proven that. Which means when your relationship becomes unpredictable, one day warm, one day cold, your nervous system starts acting like a smoke alarm with trust issues. Mine wouldn't stop ringing. Even silence felt loud. But the real breaking point came one night when we brushed past each other in the kitchen, and nothing inside me moved. No spark. No warmth. Not even the familiar sting. It was like my heart had put up a closed for repairs sign without asking for permission. That's when I realized something dangerous. Numbness is scarier than sadness. Sadness means you still care. Numbness means you're disappearing from your own life, and somewhere in that quiet collapse, in the cold light of a Danish winter dawn, I finally admitted to myself, if we didn't find a way to touch each other's hearts again, this marriage would slowly dissolve, without either of us ever saying a word. Two hearts in a foreign land. There's a strange kind of loneliness that only appears when you're living in a foreign country with the person you love. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of feeling like the world around you understands neither of you, and somehow the two of you stop understanding each other too. Denmark is beautiful, calm, peaceful. But in those early months, it felt like a mirror reflecting every crack we were trying so hard to hide. Picture two people walking through the colorful streets of Nyhavn, tourists laughing around them, boats rocking gently on the water, and yet both of them pretending everything is fine because it's easier than telling the truth. That was us. We smiled for photos. We held hands out of habit. But inside, we were like two radio stations playing on different frequencies. Close in distance, far in meaning. What nobody tells you about love abroad is that even small misunderstandings grow faster. A misread tone, a tired sigh, a delayed answer. Your brain, already overwhelmed by new routines, new weather, new culture, starts interpreting everything as danger. Psychologists say that when you're stressed, your connection radar becomes overly sensitive. So every tiny thing feels like proof that something is wrong. And trust me, winter in Denmark gives your brain plenty of time to overthink. I remember one night when the wind was so strong it rattled the windows. We were eating dinner, not arguing, not fighting, but also not talking. Just the clinking of forks, the hum of the heater, and the heavy feeling of two hearts drifting. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to say something honest, something real. But every sentence I rehearsed felt too dramatic, too heavy, too risky. So I swallowed my words like pills I didn't want to take. That it's funny how love sometimes becomes a language you stop speaking, even when you still remember all the vocabulary. One weekend, we took a train to Aarhus. The whole trip felt like a metaphor, sitting side by side but staring out of different windows. He pointed out a deer in the forest. I nodded. I pointed out a frozen lake. He hummed. Our connection felt like an old sweater losing its shape, still warm, still familiar, but stretched thin in the places that mattered most. But here's the part that stings the most. Being in a foreign land didn't break us, that he simply exposed what was already fragile. Because when you take away the distractions, your routines, your friends, your comfort zone, you're left with the truth. And the truth was this. We loved each other. But somewhere between airports and winter nights and unspoken fears, we had forgotten how to meet in the middle. The silence between us. There's a specific kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from exhaustion. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic movie scene kind. No slammed doors, no stormy arguments. Just two people slowly drifting into a quiet that feels heavier than any shouting ever could. That was the silence living in our apartment, like an invisible roommate sitting between us on the couch. One morning, I watched him pour coffee and something strange hit me. I missed him, even though he was standing 2 feet away. Psychologists call this emotional disconnection. But honestly, that phrase sounds too neat for something so messy. It's more like your heart is trying to speak through a thick glass wall. You can see each other, but the sound never reaches. Silence in a relationship doesn't arrive overnight. It sneaks in. First, you skip one conversation because you're tired. Then you avoid another because you don't want to disagree. Then suddenly you find yourself holding your breath during dinner, hoping the other person won't ask how your day was, because you're afraid you won't know how to answer without pretending. That I started noticing the tiny things. The way he looked at his phone longer than usual. The way my replies became shorter. The way we both said, "I'm fine," like we were reading from a script neither of us believed in anymore. It wasn't that we didn't care. It was that caring had become complicated. Caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. And we were tired of risks. One night we sat in bed, backs turned to each other. Not angry, just quiet. A quiet so sharp it almost made my chest ache. I remember staring at the ceiling and realizing that loneliness inside a relationship feels different from regular loneliness. It feels like your heart is knocking on a door that used to open easily, but now doesn't open at all. Science gives this silence a name: protective withdrawal. Your nervous system shuts down emotional expression to avoid conflict. But there's a cruel twist: the more you protect, the more you disconnect. It's like wearing armor to bed and wondering why you can't feel warm anymore. I tried to break the silence once. I touched his arm lightly the way I used to. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. Just neutral. And neutrality can feel like a slow heartbreak. It's the emotional equivalent of someone saying, "I'm not leaving, but I don't know how to stay." And that night, lying next to him, counting seconds between our breaths, I realized something terrifying. Silence can end a relationship long before words ever do. Because silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the absence of connection. And ours was fading like a candle running out of oxygen. A touch that changed everything. Some turning points arrive with fireworks. Ours arrived with a touch so small, so gentle it almost felt accidental. But it cracked open something in me I thought had already died. It happened on one of those gray Danish evenings when the sky hangs low like it's tired of holding itself together. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea I didn't even want, wondering when exactly love had turned into a routine of avoiding each other's eyes. He walked in quietly, the way people do when they're not sure if they're welcome. He didn't say anything, and honestly I didn't expect him to. We'd gotten too good at silence, professional level silence. Olympic silence. Silence with bonus features. But then something unexpected happened. He put his hand on my back. Not firmly. Not apologetically. Just a soft, warm, hesitant touch, like he was checking if I was still there under everything we'd both stopped saying. And for the first time in months, something inside me softened instead of tightening. It's ridiculous how powerful a single touch can be. Science says that when someone you love touches you, your brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, the "hey, we're safe here" chemical. But emotionally, it felt like someone had opened a window in a room I thought had run out of air. My chest loosened. My throat didn't feel like it was holding 1,000 unsaid sentences. My eyes stung, but not from sadness, from relief. I didn't lean away, I didn't freeze, I didn't pretend I didn't feel it. I just let the moment sit between us. He slid his hand a little lower, fingertips brushing my shoulder blade. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't sensual. It was searching. Like he was trying to find the version of me he used to know. The version who laughed loudly in supermarkets, who reached for his hand without thinking, who believed we were unbreakable. And for a second, just one, I felt her again. I wish I could say that touch magically fixed everything. That we hugged, cried, promised to communicate better, and lived happily ever after. But healing never works in straight lines. What that touch did, however, was something just as important. It reminded me that beneath all the silence, the distance, the bruised feelings, there was still something alive between us. Something warm. Something worth fighting for. Human beings are wired for connection so deeply that a gentle hand on your back can feel like forgiveness, or hope, or both. And that night when he finally whispered, "I miss us," I didn't break. I didn't shut down. I simply nodded because it was the first honest thing either of us had said in a long time. And suddenly, for the first time in months, I believed we might find our way back. Learning to care again. Healing a relationship isn't like flipping a switch. It's more like teaching your heart to walk again after forgetting how legs work. Awkward. Slow. A little embarrassing. But strangely beautiful. After that first touch, that tiny spark in the middle of a Danish winter, we didn't suddenly transform into the perfect couple. We simply became two people willing to try again. Even if trying meant fumbling like beginners, there's a funny thing about long-term love. You assume the things that used to be easy will always be easy. Reaching for his hand, asking how his day was, leaning into him on the couch. But once distance forms, even these tiny gestures feel like you're learning a new language. And honestly, we were. Not English, not Danish, but the language of care, the one you forget when your heart has been in survival mode too long. That I remember the morning he made coffee for me again. Just a cup of coffee. No speech, no symbolism, but my brain responded like he'd written a love letter. Neurologically speaking, small consistent acts of care calm the amygdala, the part of the brain that panics when it thinks love is dying. Mine had been screaming for months, and suddenly it got quiet like it was peeking out from behind a curtain going, "Wait, are we safe?" We started doing little things. He touched my arm when walking past me. I asked if he wanted to go for a walk. We cooked together even if it meant arguing over how to chop onions properly. We weren't trying to be romantic, we were just trying to be human with each other again. And sometimes that's the most romantic thing you can do. There were awkward moments too. Times when I didn't know whether to hug him or step away. Times when he tried too hard and I felt pressured. Times when old hurts resurfaced like ghosts who missed the attention. But caring doesn't erase pain. It simply gives you something softer to hold on to while facing it. One evening, while washing dishes together, our hands brushed in the soapy water. We both laughed. The kind of quiet laugh you let out when something feels familiar but new. Like remembering a song you forgot you loved. That's when I realized healing wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It was a series of tiny moments, tiny touches, tiny choices that slowly rewired the story we were telling ourselves. Love doesn't return in fireworks. It returns like morning light, subtle at first, then undeniable. And maybe that's what learning to care again really is. Not pretending nothing broke, but choosing gently and repeatedly to build something sturdier in its place. When healing feels uncomfortable, here's the part nobody warns you about. Healing doesn't feel sweet at first. Feels weird, heavy, uncomfortable in a way you can't quite explain. Like wearing a sweater that's warm but itchy. When we started getting closer again, my heart didn't immediately open like a blooming flower. No, it flinched. It hesitated. It kept waiting for something to go wrong, like a person who's been burned before touching a stove, even when it's cold. That's the psychology of it. Your brain remembers pain faster than it remembers love. Neuroscientists even say the brain reacts to emotional wounds the same way it reacts to physical ones. So every time he reached for my hand, my instinct wasn't, "Ah, sweet." It was, "Careful, don't get hurt again." Healing is rude like that. It makes you doubt the very thing you're trying to rebuild. There was a night when we sat on the edge of our bed, shoulders touching. A soft moment, a peaceful one. But inside, my thoughts were running around like unsupervised toddlers. What if this doesn't last? What if we're pretending? What if I open up and everything breaks again? It's wild how your mind can turn hope into a threat. He must have sensed the tension because he asked quietly, "Are we okay?" And I froze. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because I didn't trust myself to say the truth without sounding dramatic. So I shrugged. A tiny shrug. But inside it felt like a confession. Healing makes you clumsy with your honesty. A few days later, while cooking dinner, he hugged me from behind. It was gentle, familiar. And still I stiffened. Not because I didn't want him, but because being cared for felt foreign. Like my heart had gotten used to being guarded, and kindness felt suspicious. Psychologists call this attachment anxiety, but I call it the emotional equivalent of testing every chair before you sit down because one broke once in 2019. But here's the surprise. Discomfort is actually a sign of healing. It means the old patterns are loosening. It means your nervous system is trying to update its understanding of safety. It means you're stepping out of autopilot and into intention. Think of discomfort as your heart cracking its knuckles before learning to hold something fragile again. One evening, while walking back from the grocery store, he reached for my hand. My first instinct was to pull away. But I didn't. I let my fingers wrap around his. My heart beat fast, not with fear this time but with possibility. And in that moment I understood something important. Healing isn't supposed to feel comfortable, it's supposed to feel real. Real enough to scare you a little. Real enough to wake you up. Real enough to remind you that love worth saving will always require courage. Speaking with a healing heart. The first time I spoke honestly to him after months of avoidance, it didn't come out like a perfectly written speech. It came out messy, raw, and trembling, the way a heart finally allowed itself to speak after too long in silence. We were sitting in our living room, the Danish sunset spilling through the window, and I realized something. I had spent so long protecting myself from pain that I'd forgotten how to be seen. How to let someone in without armor. How to speak with a heart that wasn't afraid. That I started small. I felt distant, I said. Just that. Simple. No blame. No accusation. He listened. His eyes softened. And for the first time in months I felt heard. Really heard. It's amazing how much relief a simple acknowledgement can bring. Scientists have discovered that when we feel truly seen, our brains release dopamine and oxytocin, the chemicals that help us bond and trust. But emotionally, it felt like my chest was unclenching for the first time in a long while. Then he spoke. Not in rehearsed sentences, not in quiet avoidance, but with honesty. He admitted his fear, his frustration, his loneliness. And suddenly, the silence between us didn't feel like a wall anymore. Felt like a bridge. Fragile, yes. Unsteady, yes. But a bridge nonetheless. We began practicing small acts of communication every day. Not grand gestures but little truths. I need a hug. I miss talking to you. Can we try again? Each time the emotional muscles we hadn't used in months or years grew a little stronger. Like gently stretching a tendon after it stiffened. Painful at first but necessary. I also realized that speaking with a healing heart meant listening differently. Not waiting for a pause to counter. Not preparing arguments. Not rehearsing defenses. Just listening. Really listening. And when he spoke, I felt the warmth of empathy spread in my chest. Not because the words were magical, but because the intention was. Because he was choosing care over pride, closeness over distance, presence over retreat. And I chose the same point. One evening we laughed together, a real laugh, not a polite one, over something silly, a burnt omelet maybe. I noticed how naturally my hand reached for his. How our fingers intertwined without thinking. How speaking honestly and listening openly could repair spaces words had left hollow. That is the quiet magic of healing love. It doesn't roar. It whispers. It takes small, consistent gestures and stitches them into the fabric of your life. By the end of that week, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hopeful. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally knew how to show up for love without fear. How to speak, touch, and be present in ways that mattered. How to let my heart, scarred but willing, guide the way. And in that delicate, fragile space, I realized a truth worth holding on to. Love can be repaired, it can breathe again, it can thrive if we dare to speak with courage and a healing heart. Love repaired and real. By the time spring came to Copenhagen, something had quietly shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't a sudden happily ever after. It was subtle, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention. The way he laughed without checking if I was watching, the way I reached for his hand without hesitation, the way we could sit together in silence and feel warmth instead of distance. Love had returned, not as a perfect, flawless story, but as something real, tangible, and alive. That I often think about that winter when we were trapped in our own silence. Back then, I believed the cracks in our relationship were permanent, that distance and indifference had dug too deep to repair. But what I learned is that love doesn't vanish when it faces hardship. It simply waits for courage. Courage to be vulnerable. Courage to care again. Courage to let go of pride, to speak, to touch, and to truly see each other. And sometimes all it takes is a tiny gesture, a hand on the back, a whispered "I miss us," to open a door you thought was closed forever. There were still moments of fear, moments when I questioned whether we could sustain what we were rebuilding. That's normal. Healing is rarely linear. There are detours, missteps, even setbacks. But every honest conversation, every gentle touch, every act of intentional care, gradually rewired our hearts. We learned to listen without judgment, to speak without defensiveness, and to hold space for each other's imperfections. We learned that real love isn't about grand declarations or perfect timing. It's about consistency, empathy, and choosing each other over and over, even when it's hard. What's remarkable is how the small, consistent acts of love didn't just repair our marriage, they transformed it. We weren't simply returning to who we were before the silence. We were creating a deeper connection, a love tempered by understanding and compassion. And in that process, I discovered that the very things I had feared, vulnerability, openness, imperfection, were actually the keys to freedom and intimacy. The more willing I became to show up authentically, the more alive our relationship felt. Now, when I look back at that cold winter, at the loneliness and quiet despair, I don't see failure. I see a journey that taught me the power of patience, the importance of small gestures, and the undeniable truth that love, when nurtured with care and courage, can heal. It reminded me that even in moments when you feel like giving up, When the distance seems too wide and the silence too heavy, it's never too late to start again.